Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The badge in my sock drawer had been collecting dust for 14 months while I lived as Danny Corbin, small-time dealer and enforcer for the Ridgemont crew. It was a Thursday in late October, and I was sitting in the back of Jimmy Castellano's garage, counting cash from the previous night's sales when everything went sideways. The garage reeked of motor oil and stale cigarettes, that familiar smell that had become my daily reality. Jimmy ran the operation out of this converted auto shop on the outskirts of town, where the police rarely bothered to patrol, and the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. I'd been building trust with these guys since the previous summer, slowly working my way into their inner circle, while feeding information to my handler through encrypted messages sent from a burner phone I kept hidden in my truck's spare tire compartment. That morning started like any other in this twisted life I'd constructed for myself. I showed up at the garage around noon, unshaven and wearing the same torn flannel I'd worn for 3 days straight, because that's what Danny Corbin would do. The crew was already there, Jimmy pacing near his workbench, Miguel cleaning his pistol at the card table we used for meetings, and Ross sprawled on the ratty couch scrolling through his phone. But there was something different in the air, a kind of electric tension that made the hair on my neck stand up. Jimmy kept checking his watch and glancing at the door, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. Miguel had that 1,000-yard stare I'd seen before when violence was coming. These weren't the usual pre-deal jitters or paranoia from sampling too much product. This was something else entirely, something darker that made my instincts scream danger, even though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong yet. Around 2 in the afternoon, Jimmy finally stopped his pacing and called us all to gather around the workbench. He pulled out a crumpled piece of notebook paper from his pocket, smoothing it against the greasy surface with hands that trembled slightly from rage, not fear. "Carlos Vega's kid," he said, tapping the paper where he'd scrawled an address. 16 years old, goes to Ridgemont High, plays on the basketball team. My mouth went dry as I realized what this was about. Carlos Vega was the leader of the Northside crew, and 3 days ago one of his guys had shot Jimmy's cousin Eddie outside a bar downtown. Eddie survived but lost his left eye. And now Jimmy wanted blood. Not just any blood, but innocent blood. The kind that would send a message so brutal that nobody would dare touch Jimmy's family again. Miguel nodded slowly, already on board with whatever Jimmy had planned, while Ross set his phone down and leaned forward, eager to prove himself after months of being treated like the crew's errand boy. Jimmy laid out the plan, with the kind of cold precision that reminded me why the task force had spent over a year trying to bring him down. The kid, Anthony Vega, had basketball practice every Thursday until 5:30. His mom would pick him up usually, but Jimmy had learned through his network of informants that she had a doctor's appointment in the city today and wouldn't be back until 7. That gave us a 2-hour window. Ross would wait in the school parking lot in a stolen van. He'd already picked one out from the long-term parking at the airport, something nobody would report missing for days. Miguel and I would grab the kid when he walked out to wait for his ride, force him into the van before anyone noticed. The way Jimmy described it, casual and matter-of-fact, you'd think he was planning a grocery run instead of a kidnapping. But the worst part came next. Jimmy had already prepared a spot in the old Henderson farmhouse, abandoned for 5 years after a fire destroyed half the structure. He'd been out there that morning, setting up plastic sheeting and tools in what used to be the root cellar. Tools he described in detail that made bile rise in my throat. The thing about deep cover work is that you have to participate in crimes to maintain your credibility. But there are lines you never cross. Kidnapping and murdering a teenager was so far past that line I couldn't even see it anymore. But if I tried to talk Jimmy out of it or showed any hesitation, I'd either blow my cover or end up buried in the desert myself. These guys didn't tolerate weakness or second thoughts. I'd seen what happened to Ricky Moreno when he'd suggested maybe they should ease up on distribution near the elementary school. Jimmy had personally broken 3 of his fingers with a pipe wrench while the rest of us watched. So I nodded along, playing the part of Danny Corbin, trying to figure out how the hell I was going to stop this without getting myself and the kid killed. My handler, Detective Morrison, was expecting my weekly check-in tomorrow morning, but by then Anthony Vega would already be dead. The burner phone in my truck might as well have been on the moon for all the good it would do me now. We spent the next hour going over every detail until I could recite the plan in my sleep. At 4:15, we'd position ourselves around the school. Ross would already be in the van, engine running, parked near the gym exit where the basketball team always came out. Miguel would stand by the bike racks, pretending to text on his phone while keeping watch for teachers or security. I'd be the one to actually approach Anthony. Jimmy figured my younger appearance and casual demeanor would make the kid less suspicious initially. All I had to do was ask him for help with my car, maybe claim I needed a jump start, get him close enough to the van for Miguel to help me force him inside. The whole thing should take less than 30 seconds if we did it right. After that, we'd drive separate routes to the farmhouse where Jimmy would be waiting. He wanted to handle the actual killing himself, said it was personal, family business. The way he said it with this satisfied little nod made me realize he was actually looking forward to it. This wasn't just about sending a message anymore. Jimmy had developed a taste for this kind of violence. At 3:45, we loaded into our vehicles. I climbed into my beat-up Ford pickup, the one with the rusted door that squealed every time you opened it, and the passenger window that wouldn't roll up the last 2 inches. Miguel rode with Ross in a Honda Accord they'd use to dump later, while Jimmy headed out to the farmhouse in his Suburban to finish preparations. As I drove toward Ridgemont High, my mind raced through possibilities. I could fake a breakdown, claim my truck wouldn't start, but that would only delay things and make Jimmy suspicious. I could try to warn the kid somehow, slip him a note or whisper something when I approached him, but if Miguel saw anything unusual, we'd both be dead before sunset. The police station was 12 minutes from the school, but calling them would mean revealing myself and potentially getting Anthony shot in the crossfire if Jimmy's crew decided to go down fighting. Every scenario I ran through ended with someone dying, and the clock on my dashboard seemed to be moving at double speed. I parked across from the school at 4:20, watching students stream out of various buildings. The gym was a newer addition to the campus, all glass and steel that looked out of place next to the older brick buildings. Through the windows, I could see the basketball team still practicing, the coach making them run drills while Anthony, tall for 16 with his father's distinctive jawline, practiced free throws at the far end. Ross's van was already in position, some plumber's vehicle with faded lettering on the side that he'd hot-wired that morning. Miguel stood exactly where he was supposed to be, casual but alert, occasionally glancing at his phone but mostly watching the doors. Everything was falling into place for a crime that would destroy multiple families and likely spark a war that would leave dozens dead. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, trying to look calm while my brain screamed for a solution that wouldn't end in catastrophe. At 5:32, the gym doors pushed open and the team started filing out. Anthony came out third, his basketball shoes squeaking on the concrete as he walked, gym bag slung over one shoulder, and his phone already in his hand, probably texting his mom about the ride. He was wearing a Lakers jersey over his practice gear, number 24, and despite everything I knew about his father's criminal empire, the kid just looked like any other teenager heading home after practice. That's when something shifted in my chest, a kind of clarity that cut through all the careful planning and calculated risks. I wasn't going to let this happen. Period. Even if it meant throwing away 14 months of undercover work, even if it meant putting a target on my own back, I couldn't stand by while Jimmy tortured and killed a 16-year-old boy whose only crime was sharing DNA with the wrong person. I reached under my seat where I kept a throwaway pistol, checked the magazine, and tucked it into my waistband under my flannel. Then I stepped out of the truck and started walking toward Anthony, knowing that the next 5 minutes would either save his life or end mine. Miguel saw me approaching and gave a subtle nod, moving into position near the bike racks. Ross had the van running, exhaust visible in the cooling afternoon air. Anthony was standing near the curb, still looking at his phone, completely unaware that 3 men were converging on him with the worst possible intentions. When I got within 10 feet, I called out, "Hey, Anthony Vega?" The kid looked up, confused but not alarmed, probably thinking I was someone's parent or maybe a scout. That's when I made my choice. Instead of feeding him the story about my car, I walked straight up to him and said quietly but firmly, "You need to come with me right now. Your life is in danger. I'm a cop." His eyes went wide and he started to back away, which was exactly the wrong move because it brought him closer to where Miguel was approaching from behind. I grabbed his arm, not hard but firm enough to stop him, and that's when Miguel realized something was wrong. He reached for his waistband where I knew he kept a Glock 19, and everything went into slow motion. I pulled my pistol and aimed it at Miguel before he could clear his weapon, shouting, "Police! Nobody move!" loud enough for everyone in the parking lot to hear. Miguel's face went through about 5 different emotions in 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, then pure rage as he realized Danny Corbin had been a cop this whole time. Ross jumped out of the van, saw me with my gun drawn, and immediately peeled out, tires screaming as he fled the scene. He'd always been a coward when things got real. Miguel, though, he wasn't running. His hand was still on his gun, and I could see him calculating whether he could draw and fire before I pulled the trigger. "Don't do it, Miguel," I said, keeping my voice steady, even though adrenaline was flooding my system. "It's over. Jimmy's whole operation is done. We've got 14 months of evidence." Behind me, Anthony had dropped into a crouch, smart kid, making himself a smaller target. Other students were screaming, running back toward the school or diving behind cars. Someone was definitely calling 911, which meant real backup would be here soon. But Miguel still hadn't moved his hand away from his weapon. The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, but felt like an hour. Then Miguel made his decision. His hand moved fast, but I was already squeezing the trigger. The shot was loud, impossibly loud in the open air of the parking lot, and Miguel spun and dropped, his gun clattering across the asphalt. I'd hit him in the shoulder, a clean shot that would put him down without killing him. As sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer by the second, I kept my gun trained on Miguel while pulling out my actual badge with my free hand, holding it up so everyone could see it. "Everyone stay calm," I shouted. "Police officer, the situation is under control." I looked at Anthony, who was staring at me with a mixture of terror and confusion. "You're safe now," I told him. "Your dad sent us to protect you. Just stay down until the uniforms get here." It was a lie about his dad, but the kid didn't need to know the whole truth right now. Within 3 minutes, the parking lot was swarming with police cars, and I was on the phone with Detective Morrison, giving him Jimmy's location at the farmhouse. They picked Jimmy up 20 minutes later, caught him red-handed with the torture tools he'd prepared. The whole Ridgemont crew went down that night, 17 arrests total, including suppliers and distributors I'd identified during my time undercover. The drug war that had been tearing the town apart for 3 years ended with a single shot in a high school parking lot, and Anthony Vega went home to his family, never knowing how close he'd come to becoming a casualty of his father's business. Everyone always asks me why I quit being a cop after just 6 years on the force. The truth is, one night in early September of 2017 changed everything for me. I was 28, still pretty green compared to the veterans at the precinct, but confident enough to handle the night shift patrols through the east side of our city. I'd been married to Amanda for 3 years, and we'd just bought our first house together, a little ranch-style place with a leaky garage and a backyard big enough for the kids we were planning to have. Life was good, you know. I had the job I'd wanted since high school, a woman who loved me despite the crazy hours, and enough saved up to finally feel like a real adult. That night started like any other. Roll call at 10 p.m., bad coffee in a styrofoam cup, and Officer Brennan, my partner, complaining about his ex-wife's latest demands for alimony. Around 1:30 a.m., we were cruising down Riverside Avenue when I spotted this beat-up Chevy Malibu with a busted left taillight. Nothing unusual, probably just someone who hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet. Brennan was finishing up some paperwork from our last call, a domestic dispute that ended peacefully, so I told him I'd handle this one solo while he wrapped up. The Malibu pulled over immediately when I hit the lights, parking right under this flickering street lamp that kept making everything look like an old movie. The driver kept his hands on the wheel, which I appreciated. Always makes these stops easier when people know the drill. I grabbed my flashlight, did the usual check of my body cam to make sure it was recording, and stepped out into the humid September air. The crickets were going crazy that night, almost drowning out the sound of my boots on the asphalt as I walked up to the driver's side window. The guy behind the wheel looked maybe 45, 50 at most. Salt and pepper beard that hadn't seen a trim in months, wearing this faded Metallica t-shirt with holes near the collar. His eyes were bloodshot, but not in a drunk way, more like someone who hadn't slept in days. There was this weird smell coming from the car, kind of metallic mixed with something sweet, like copper pennies soaked in maple syrup. I asked for his license and registration, keeping my tone friendly but professional, the way they teach you at the academy. He nodded real slow, like he was moving through molasses, and reached for his glove compartment with his right hand, while his left stayed glued to the steering wheel. I remember thinking his fingernails were way too clean for someone driving such a messy car. The back seat was piled with fast food bags, empty energy drink cans, and what looked like a bunch of old newspapers tied with twine. "License is in my pocket," he said, and his voice had this raspy quality, like he'd been screaming at a concert all night. He shifted in his seat to reach for his back pocket, and that's when everything went straight to hell. Instead of pulling out a wallet, his hand came up with a Glock 19. I knew the model because it's what half the guys at the range use. Time didn't slow down like they say in the movies. If anything, it sped up into this insane blur of movement and adrenaline. He swung that barrel toward my face, maybe 8 inches from my nose, and I heard the most terrifying sound of my entire life. Click. Nothing else, just click. The gun didn't fire. His eyes went wide with surprise, almost like he couldn't believe it himself. And for maybe half a second, we both just stared at each other, frozen in this moment of mutual shock. My training kicked in before my brain could even process what was happening. I grabbed his wrist with both hands and slammed it against the door frame while using my body weight to pin him against his seat. The gun fell somewhere between the seat and the center console, and he started thrashing like a wild animal, trying to bite my forearms through my uniform. He was stronger than he looked, wiry muscle under that shabby appearance, and he kept making these guttural sounds, not quite words but not quite screams either. My body cam must have caught it all. The wrestling match through the window, me trying to radio for backup while keeping him pinned, him clawing at my duty belt trying to get my service weapon. Brennan heard the commotion and came running, and together we managed to drag him out onto the pavement. The whole struggle maybe lasted 90 seconds, but each second felt like an hour, especially knowing that Gunn was still somewhere in that car, possibly ready to fire if he got to it again. When backup arrived and we finally had him in cuffs, I went back to look at that Glock. The magazine was full, one in the chamber, safety off, everything ready to go. The only thing that saved my life was a bad primer on that first round. The firearms instructor at the precinct later told me it happens maybe 1 in 10,000 rounds, usually with cheap ammunition or rounds that got wet and dried out. This guy, turned out his name was Gerald Hutchins, had been on a 3-day meth binge and thought I was someone from his past coming to collect a debt. At least that's what he kept rambling about during booking. He had 2 previous arrests for assault and had just gotten out of county jail 6 weeks earlier. The newspapers barely covered it, just a small article on page 4 about an officer-involved incident with no injuries. But here's the thing nobody tells you about almost dying. It's not the moment itself that messes you up. It's everything that comes after. I went home that morning around 6 a.m., and Amanda was in the kitchen making scrambled eggs, humming some Taylor Swift song, completely unaware that I'd almost become another statistic. I stood in the doorway watching her, still wearing my uniform that smelled like sweat and that weird metallic sweetness from Hutchins' car, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her. How do you explain that a manufacturing defect, a tiny flaw in a piece of brass and gunpowder, was the only reason she wasn't about to get a visit from the chief and a chaplain? I told her it was a rough night, took a shower that lasted until the hot water ran out, and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that Glock's barrel pointed at my face, could hear that click echoing in my skull like a broken record. The department made me talk to a counselor, standard procedure, after what they classified as a critical incident. Dr. Lawson had this office downtown with too many potted plants and a white noise machine that sounded like rain on a tent. She kept asking me how I felt about what happened, and I kept telling her I was fine, that it was part of the job, that I knew the risks when I signed up. But that was garbage, and we both knew it. The truth was, every traffic stop after that night made my chest tight. I'd see a driver reach for their wallet, and my hand would instinctively go to my weapon. I started letting Brennan take the lead on stops, making excuses about paperwork or radio calls. He knew something was up, partners always know, but he didn't push it. Maybe he'd had his own close calls and understood that some things change you in ways you can't quite explain. 3 weeks after the incident, I was at a barbecue at my brother-in-law's place. Kids were running around with water guns, and when my 5-year-old nephew pointed his bright orange super soaker at me and yelled, "Bang!" I hit the deck. Just dropped flat on the grass in front of 20 people, including Amanda's entire family. They laughed at first, thinking I was playing along, but when I didn't get up right away, when they saw me lying there trying to remember how to breathe normally, the laughter died pretty quick. My nephew started crying because he thought he'd hurt me somehow, and I had to spend the rest of the afternoon convincing a kindergartner that it wasn't his fault Uncle Kevin was acting weird. Amanda drove us home in silence, but I caught her Googling PTSD symptoms on her phone when she thought I was asleep that night. She started treating me like I was made of glass, always asking if I was okay, watching me when she thought I wasn't looking. The dreams were the worst part. Not nightmares exactly, but these hyper-realistic replays where sometimes the gun fired and sometimes it didn't. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., patting my chest, checking for bullet holes that weren't there. One night about 2 months after the incident, I dreamed that Hutchins was in our bedroom, standing at the foot of the bed with that same Glock, pulling the trigger over and over while it just kept clicking. Amanda woke me up because I was apparently shouting, it's jammed," in my sleep. That's when I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. I went back to Dr. Lawson, but this time I actually talked. Told her about the water gun incident, the dreams, how I'd started avoiding certain streets because they reminded me of Riverside Avenue. She said what I was experiencing was completely normal for someone who'd survived what she called a near-miss fatality event. I tried going back to regular patrol duty after 3 months of desk work, but it wasn't the same. Every single traffic stop felt like Russian roulette. I'd run the plates 3 times, call for backup for broken taillights, approach vehicles with my hand already unsnapping my holster. The other officers started noticing. You can't hide that level of paranoia from people trained to read body language. The final straw came on a Wednesday night in January. I pulled over a soccer mom in a minivan for rolling through a stop sign. When she reached into her purse for her license, I drew my weapon, pointed it at a 40-year-old mother of 3 who was just trying to get home from her kid's piano recital. The look of absolute terror on her face, the way her teenage daughter in the passenger seat started recording with her phone while crying. That image is burned into my brain forever. I holstered my weapon, apologized probably 50 times, didn't even give her a warning, just told her to drive safe, and walked back to my patrol car with legs that felt like water. I turned in my badge and gun the next morning. The chief tried to talk me out of it, said I just needed more time, maybe a different assignment, but I knew I was done. That tiny mechanical failure, that one bad primer, had saved my life, but killed the cop in me. I work in private security now, monitoring cameras at a corporate office building where the biggest threat is someone forgetting their key card. Amanda supported the decision, said she'd rather have a living husband than a dead hero. Hutchins got 15 years for attempted murder of a police officer. His public defender tried to argue the gun malfunction showed lack of intent, but the jury didn't buy it. Sometimes I drive past Riverside Avenue on my way to work, and I can still see that flickering streetlight, still hear those crickets, still feel the weight of that Glock pointing at my face. But mostly, I just feel grateful for faulty ammunition and the second chance it gave me to realize that some jobs aren't worth dying for, no matter how much you thought you wanted them. Seven months into being a patrol officer in Phoenix, Arizona, I thought I'd seen most of what suburban calls had to offer. It was a Saturday afternoon in early August, the kind of scorching day where the asphalt literally melts your shoe soles if you stand still too long. My partner that day was Officer Diane Crawford, a 20-year veteran with gray streaking through her auburn hair, and this habit of humming old Motown songs when she got nervous. We were finishing up paperwork from a minor fender bender when dispatch crackled through about repeated 911 hang-ups from 4782 Saguaro Drive. The address had called 3 times in the past hour, each time disconnecting before saying anything. Standard protocol meant we had to check it out, make sure nobody was in distress or unable to speak freely. The house stood out even before we pulled into the driveway, not because of anything obviously wrong, but because everything looked too perfect. The lawn was immaculate despite the drought restrictions. Every blade of grass exactly the same height, like someone had measured it with a ruler. The windows had these heavy burgundy curtains drawn tight even though it was mid-afternoon, and there were 3 newspapers still in their plastic bags sitting on the porch steps. Diane stopped humming the second we parked, which told me her instincts were firing too. The woman who answered the door couldn't have been older than 35, with dishwater blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail so tight it made her temples look stretched. She wore a faded Arizona State University sweatshirt despite the heat, and her feet were bare on the marble entryway floor. She introduced herself as Natalie Garrison, smiled this practiced smile that reminded me of department store mannequins, and insisted everything was perfectly fine. Diane asked if we could come in just to verify everyone was safe. Standard procedure for hang-up calls. Natalie's left eye twitched just once, like a camera shutter clicking, but she stepped aside and let us in. The living room smelled like vanilla candles trying too hard to cover something else, maybe bleach or that industrial carpet cleaner they use in hotels. Every surface gleamed like it had been polished minutes before we arrived. The coffee table had these perfect vacuum lines in the carpet around it, forming a precise square, and the throw pillows on the couch were arranged with mathematical precision. But what really caught my attention were the family photos on the mantel. All of them were turned face down except for one showing Natalie with a golden retriever at some beach. She kept rubbing her wrist where a tan line suggested she usually wore a watch, but the watch was nowhere to be seen. While Diane made small talk about the heat wave, asking Natalie if her air conditioning was working properly, I heard it. This rhythmic thumping from somewhere above us, muffled but deliberate. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more taps. Natalie must have noticed me looking up because she immediately launched into this story about having raccoons in the attic, how the pest control guy was coming Monday, how they'd been driving her crazy all week. But raccoons don't tap in patterns, and they definitely don't tap in what I recognized as SOS code from my Navy days before joining the force. Diane caught my eye, and I knew she'd heard it too. She casually asked Natalie if she lived alone, and Natalie said yes, her boyfriend had moved out 6 months ago. Very amicable split. They were still friends, actually. The tapping stopped the moment she said that, like whoever was up there was listening to every word. Diane smoothly transitioned into asking about the 911 calls, keeping her tone conversational, like she was discussing the weather. Natalie's explanation came out rehearsed. Her new phone was glitchy. She'd been trying to order pizza but kept hitting emergency call by mistake. She was so embarrassed about wasting our time. As she spoke, I noticed fresh scratches on the doorframe leading to the hallway. 4 parallel lines like someone had dragged their fingernails down the wood trying to hold on. The tapping started again upstairs, more urgent this time, and I saw a bead of sweat roll down Natalie's temple despite the house being cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. She kept glancing at this specific spot on the ceiling, right where her dining room chandelier hung, and each time she looked, her jaw clenched tighter. Diane asked if we could take a quick look around just to file a complete report, and Natalie's whole body went rigid like someone had poured concrete into her veins. "Of course," she said, her voice pitched just a bit too high. "But please be quiet going upstairs because my neighbor works nights and complains about every little sound." That didn't make any sense. We were in a single-family home with good spacing between houses, but I kept that observation to myself. As we headed toward the staircase, Natalie positioned herself between us and the kitchen, and I caught a glimpse of what looked like zip ties on the counter next to a roll of duct tape. The stairs themselves were carpeted in this thick beige pile that muffled our footsteps, but I could feel them vibrating slightly under my boots, like something heavy was moving around above us. Halfway up, there was a dark stain on the wall about shoulder height, brownish red and shaped like a handprint, which Natalie quickly explained was pasta sauce from when she'd been carrying dinner upstairs last week. But pasta sauce doesn't leave textile patterns from someone's palm, and it definitely doesn't streak downward, like someone had been dragged past it. The upstairs hallway stretched longer than it should have for a house this size, with 5 doors all painted the same shade of cream except for the last one on the right, which had been recently repainted. You could still smell the fumes. Natalie stayed right behind us, close enough that I could hear her breathing getting shallower with each step we took toward that freshly painted door. The tapping had stopped completely now, replaced by this weird scratching sound like fingernails on wood, coming from above the hallway ceiling. "That's the attic access," Natalie said quickly, pointing to a pull-down door with a string hanging from it. "But it's been painted shut for years. Previous owners did it, never been able to open it." The string was new though, white and clean against the yellowed ceiling, and there were fingerprints in the dust on the frame. Diane reached for the string, and Natalie actually grabbed her wrist, not aggressively, but desperately, like someone reaching for a lifeline. "Please, there's nothing up there but insulation and rat droppings," she said, and her voice cracked on the word, "nothing." That's when we heard the voice, muffled but distinctly male, calling out something that sounded like "help," or maybe "here." Natalie's face went the color of printer paper, and she started talking fast about how the TV must have turned on by itself. Happens all the time. The remote was broken, but there was no TV upstairs that we could see. Diane gently but firmly moved Natalie's hand away and pulled the attic door down. The ladder unfolded with a metallic screech that made Natalie flinch, and a smell rolled out. Sweat, urine, and something else. That copper penny taste that hits the back of your throat when someone's been bleeding. I went up first, flashlight in one hand, other hand on my service weapon. The attic was sweltering, had to be 40 degrees hotter than the rest of the house, and in the beam of my flashlight, I saw him. A man, probably mid-30s, bound with zip ties at his wrists and ankles, duct tape across his mouth, lying on a piece of plywood between the joists. His eyes went wide when he saw me, and he started making these frantic noises through the tape, nodding his head toward where Natalie stood at the bottom of the ladder. The man's shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing bruises in various stages of healing. Some purple fresh, others that greenish yellow of week-old injuries. His wrists were raw and bleeding where he'd been struggling against the zip ties, and there were cuts on his fingertips from where he'd been tapping and scratching at the floorboards trying to get our attention. I called down for Diane to secure Natalie and request backup immediately. But when I looked through the attic opening, Natalie was already backing away down the hallway, her hands reaching into her sweatshirt pocket. Diane had her hand on her radio, calling it in, when Natalie pulled out a box cutter and held it to her own throat. "He was going to leave me," she said, her voice eerily calm now, all pretense dropped. "After everything I did for him, after I took care of him when he was sick, after I paid his student loans, he was just going to walk away like I was nothing." The man in the attic, who I'd later learn was named Brandon Fuller, her ex-boyfriend, started struggling harder against his restraints, tears streaming down his face. Diane handled Natalie with the kind of precision you only get from decades on the job, talking her down while slowly moving closer, keeping her focused on explaining her side of the story. Natalie rambled about how Brandon had tried to break up with her the previous Monday, how she'd put sleeping pills in his coffee when he came to get his things, how she'd only meant to keep him until he remembered how much he loved her. She'd been bringing him food and water twice a day, she insisted, like that somehow made it better. While Diane kept her talking, I cut Brandon free with my utility knife. His first words when I pulled the tape off were, "Check her basement, please check her basement." When I asked him what was in the basement, he just shook his head and said, "Not what, who?" Her other ex from 2 years ago. She told me about him when she thought I was unconscious. She said he's still down there. The backup units arrived just as Natalie dropped the box cutter and fell to her knees, sobbing about how nobody ever stayed, how they all promised forever but nobody meant it. The basement search turned up exactly what Brandon had warned us about. Behind a false wall made of unpainted drywall, we found human remains that the coroner later identified as Christopher Shelton, a 31-year-old software developer who'd been reported missing 2 years earlier. His family had been told he'd moved to Canada for work, emails sent from his account, messages about starting fresh. Natalie had been maintaining his social media, posting occasionally, responding to birthday wishes, keeping the illusion alive. She'd even filed his taxes. The detail that still haunts me was a notebook we found in her bedroom, filled with practice signatures. She'd been learning to forge both men's handwriting, pages and pages of their names written over and over until she got them perfect. Brandon had been up in that attic for 53 hours when we found him, surviving on bottled water and granola bars she'd bring him while lecturing him about commitment and trust. He told us later that she'd stand at the bottom of the attic ladder for hours, reading their old text messages out loud, analyzing where things went wrong. The trial made national news for about a week before something else grabbed the headlines. Natalie got life without parole for Christopher's murder, plus 20 years for kidnapping and false imprisonment of Brandon. Brandon moved to Colorado last I heard, changed his name, trying to rebuild. Diane retired 3 months after that call, said she'd seen enough. As for me, I still work patrol, but I think about that house every time we get a domestic call. The thing that really sticks with me isn't the violence or even finding Christopher. It's those 3 newspapers on the porch. Natalie had kept up every single appearance of normalcy, every detail of an ordinary life, while holding a man captive in her attic and keeping another buried in her basement. She'd been watering that perfect lawn, vacuuming those precise lines in the carpet, turning those picture frames face down one by one, all while Brandon tapped out SOS messages above her head. Sometimes the most dangerous houses are the ones that look the safest from the street. These days, when we get repeated hang-up calls, I always check the attic and the basement, no matter how normal everything seems. Because now I know that sometimes the person who answers the door with a smile isn't the one who needs saving. The fluorescent lights in the break room were giving me a headache that Tuesday afternoon, in March 2022. I was the overnight security guard at ShopMart on the outskirts of Tulsa, and I'd been pulling double shifts to cover for my co-worker who'd quit without notice. At 34, I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at me: shoplifters, drunk teenagers, the occasional domestic dispute in the parking lot. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened during my shift that night. My wife Melissa kept texting me to remember to pick up milk on my way home, and I kept telling her I would, completely unaware that in just a few hours, I'd be standing in that same dairy aisle watching paramedics work on something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The evening started like any other. I clocked in at 10 p.m., did my first round through the store, checked all the exits and settled into my station near the main entrance. Harold, the night stock manager, was already unloading pallets in the back, and Janet from the deli was cleaning up her section before heading home. Around 11:30, I noticed this guy pull into the far corner of the parking lot in a beat-up Ford Taurus. Nothing unusual about that. We get people sleeping in their cars sometimes, and as long as they don't cause trouble, I let them be. But this guy, he just sat there with his engine running, interior light on, and I could see him moving around inside like he was looking for something. He had this strange way of jerking his head, almost like he was trying to shake water out of his ear. I watched him on the security monitor for about 20 minutes. The quality wasn't great. Those cameras were older than my nephew's Xbox. But I could make out enough details. White male, probably mid-40s, wearing what looked like a business shirt and dark pants. What struck me was how he kept touching his chest and stomach area, patting himself down like he'd lost his wallet or keys. Then he'd stop, sit perfectly still for maybe 30 seconds, and start the whole routine again. I thought about walking out there to check on him, but honestly, dealing with potentially unstable people wasn't worth the $15.50 an hour they paid me. Besides, he wasn't bothering anyone, and the lot was practically empty except for Harold's pickup and a few other employee vehicles near the building. At 12:17 a.m., I remember the exact time because I'd just logged it in my report. Things got weird. The guy suddenly threw his car door open and practically fell out onto the asphalt. He caught himself on the door frame and stood there, swaying slightly. Even from my position inside, I could tell something was wrong with how he moved. It wasn't drunk stumbling or drug-induced wobbling. I'd seen plenty of both. This was different. He moved like every step hurt, like his shoes were filled with broken glass. His hands kept going to his midsection, clutching at his shirt, and I could see him looking down at himself with this expression of complete bewilderment. That's when I decided to call Harold on the radio and let him know I was going to check on a customer in the lot. Before I could even grab my flashlight, the man took 3 steps away from his car and dropped to his knees. The parking lot lights cast these long shadows, and I saw him raise his arms like he was trying to take off an invisible jacket. Then, and I swear on my mother's grave this is exactly what I saw, smoke started rising from his body. Not a lot at first, just these thin wisps coming off his shoulders and back like steam from a hot shower. But within seconds, it got thicker, darker. I stood there behind the glass doors, my radio halfway to my mouth, completely frozen by what I was witnessing. The man fell forward onto his hands, and that's when I saw the first flash of orange. Actual flames, small ones, dancing along the collar of his shirt and spreading down his spine like someone had drawn a line of gasoline there. I burst through the doors, shouting into my radio for Harold to call 911. The cold March air hit me like a wall, and with it came a smell I'll never forget. Not quite like barbecue, not quite like burning plastic, but something sickeningly in between. The man was maybe 50 feet away, and by the time I'd covered half that distance, he was fully engulfed. The flames weren't normal fire colors either. They had this weird blue-white core that hurt to look at directly, like staring at a welding torch. He wasn't screaming, which somehow made it worse. He just knelt there on the asphalt, arms spread wide, head tilted back toward the sky. I got within 10 feet before the heat forced me back. It was intense, like opening an oven door. But here's the thing that still messes with my head. The heat only radiated from him. The ground around him wasn't even warm. I touched the pavement later, after everything was over, and it was still cool from the evening air. Harold came running out with a fire extinguisher, but I grabbed his arm before he could get close. We both just stood there, helpless, watching this man burn like a human candle in the middle of an empty parking lot. The flames were reaching maybe 6 feet high now, and through the fire I could still see his silhouette, still in that same kneeling position. It lasted maybe 2 minutes total, though it felt like hours, before the flames suddenly died down like someone had turned off a gas valve. What was left barely looked human anymore. The smell got worse, if that was possible, and Harold turned away to vomit near the cart corral. I managed to keep it together, but only because I was in complete shock. The Ford Taurus was still running behind us, headlights cutting through the darkness. radio playing some old country song that seemed obscenely cheerful given what we'd just witnessed. The fire department arrived within 8 minutes, followed closely by the police and paramedics. They pronounced him dead at the scene. No surprise there. What did surprise everyone was the state of the parking lot. Not a single scorch mark on the asphalt. Not one. The investigators kept walking around the body, taking photos, measuring distances, looking completely baffled. Detective Reeves, a woman with 30 years on the force, pulled me aside for questioning. She had me go through everything 3 times, and each time she looked more troubled. "In all my years," she said, shaking her head, "I've never seen anything like this. No accelerant residue, no fuel source, nothing flammable on the victim's clothes that we can detect. Hell, his car keys in his pocket didn't even melt all the way." She showed me an evidence bag with the keys. Warped and discolored, sure, but still recognizable. The car was untouched, still running, with a full tank of gas just 8 feet from where the man had burned to death. They kept us there until almost 4 a.m., going over everything again and again. Harold and I had to write separate statements, and they took our clothes as evidence, gave us these paper coveralls to wear home. While the forensics team worked, I overheard one of them mention something about the body temperature. Even after burning that intensely, the corpse's internal temperature was supposedly lower than it should have been. Like he burned from the outside in, the text said, which made no sense at all. They found the man's wallet in the car. His name was Nathan Berkeley, 44 years old, from a town about 2 hours away. Married, 2 kids, worked as an insurance adjuster. No criminal record, no history of mental illness according to the preliminary background check. Just a regular guy who spontaneously combusted in our parking lot for no discernible reason. The security footage only made things more confusing. I had to watch it with the detectives at least a dozen times over the next few days. The cameras showed exactly what I'd described. Nathan sitting in his car, getting out, walking those painful steps, then the smoke and flames. But here's what really got to everyone. In the last clear frame before the flames obscured him, Nathan appeared to be looking at something. Not at the store, not at the sky, but at a specific spot in the empty parking lot beside him. He was staring intently at absolutely nothing, his mouth moving like he was talking to someone. The tech enhanced the image as much as possible, even tried reading his lips, but came up with nothing conclusive. Just a man having a conversation with empty air seconds before he burst into flames that shouldn't have been possible. The case made the local news, of course. Mysterious death in Shopmart parking lot ran for about a week before getting pushed aside by other stories. The store hired a counselor to come talk to Harold and me. But what were we supposed to say? That we watched a man burn alive without any logical explanation? That the laws of physics seemed to take a coffee break that night? I went back to work after a week off. Bills don't pay themselves. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. Every time someone parked in that corner of the lot, I'd watch them like a hawk. Harold quit about a month later, said he couldn't handle the night shift anymore. Can't say I blamed him. I started carrying a fire extinguisher on my rounds, though I knew deep down it wouldn't matter if whatever happened to Nathan Berkeley happened again. 3 months after the incident, Nathan's widow contacted me. Sheila Berkeley was a small woman with tired eyes who looked like she'd aged a decade in those few months. She asked to meet me at a coffee shop downtown, said she had questions the police couldn't answer. Over bitter coffee and untouched pie, she told me things that made my skin prickle. Nathan had been acting strange for weeks before his death. He'd wake up in the middle of the night complaining about being too hot, even with the AC blasting. He'd started avoiding mirrors, claiming he could see heat waves rising off his reflection. The worst part? The day he died, he'd called her from the road, terrified, saying he could feel something burning inside him, growing stronger. He'd pulled into our parking lot hoping to find a bathroom, thinking maybe water would help. He said it felt like his soul was on fire, Sheila whispered, gripping her coffee cup with white knuckles. I thought he was having a breakdown. She left me with his final voicemail, and I've never been able to bring myself to delete it from my phone. In it, Nathan's panicked voice says 6 words that haunt me. It's here. God help me, it's here. Last Thursday night changed everything for me. I was driving back from visiting my sister Grace in Charleston, about 3 hours from home. It was past midnight, and I'd been on the road since 9, fighting to stay awake with gas station coffee and whatever garbage was playing on the radio. The interstate was empty, except for the occasional trucker, and I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt with just my headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. I worked as a night shift security guard at a distribution center back then, so late hours never bothered me much. But that particular stretch of I-26 always made me uneasy. Miles and miles of nothing but pine trees and the occasional deer crossing sign. About an hour from home, I saw the hazard lights first. A sedan was pulled over on the shoulder, hood popped open, and someone was standing next to it waving their arms. My first instinct was to keep driving. You hear stories, right? But then I noticed another car had already stopped to help, parked maybe 20 feet behind with its headlights illuminating the broken-down vehicle. The Good Samaritan was walking toward the stranded driver, and something about seeing someone else already helping made me slow down. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was that weird feeling you get when you witness something happening in real time. I pulled over about 50 feet behind both cars and killed my engine, leaving my lights on. Through my windshield, I could see the helper was a big guy, probably 6'2", wearing jeans and a dark jacket. The stranded driver was smaller, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. The helper reached the driver and they appeared to be talking. I grabbed my phone, thinking maybe I should call AAA for them or something, when the conversation between them shifted. The smaller person's body language changed, went from helpless motorist to something else entirely. They took a step back, and even from where I sat, I could see the helper raising his hands slightly, like he was trying to calm someone down. Then it happened so fast I almost didn't process it. The stranded driver pulled something from their waistband. The motion was smooth, practiced. The crack of the gunshot was muffled by distance but unmistakable. The big guy crumpled backward, hitting the asphalt hard. I sat there for maybe 2 seconds, my brain refusing to accept what I'd just seen. The shooter stood over the fallen man for a moment, then started going through his pockets with quick, efficient movements. My whole body went rigid. Every survival instinct screamed at me to drive away, but I couldn't move. The shooter was pulling the helper toward the shoulder, dragging him by his arms. That's when I noticed the victim's car keys glinting in the shooter's hand. They walked to the helper's car, a newer model pickup truck, and got in without hesitation. The engine started immediately, and they pulled out onto the interstate, accelerating smoothly like nothing had happened. Their original sedan sat there abandoned, hazards still blinking. I finally managed to dial 911, my voice cracking as I tried to explain what I'd witnessed. The operator kept asking me to repeat myself because I was talking too fast, words tumbling over each other. While I was on the phone, I got out and ran to the man on the ground, though I knew it was too late. His badge had fallen out of his pocket during the struggle, a sheriff's deputy shield from the next county over. The first responders arrived within 12 minutes, but those were the longest 12 minutes of my life. I stayed with the deputy, kneeling beside him on the cold asphalt, trying not to look at the wound. His wallet had spilled open, and I could see pictures of 2 kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old, smiling in what looked like school photos. The investigating officers treated me with this weird mixture of urgency and care. They needed every detail I could remember, but they could also see I was barely holding it together. They kept asking about the shooter's appearance, and I tried my best, but honestly, with the baseball cap and the darkness, I couldn't give them much. Average height, maybe 5'8" or 5'9", thin build, wearing dark clothes. The abandoned sedan turned out to be stolen from a shopping center 3 states away. They found fake plates in the trunk, along with burglary tools and a backpack full of cash from what I later learned was a string of convenience store robberies. State troopers set up roadblocks within the hour, and the story exploded across the news. Every local station led with it. Off-duty deputy murdered while trying to help motorist, suspect armed and dangerous, driving the victim's black Chevrolet Silverado. They kept showing the deputy's official photo, and seeing his face in uniform hit different than seeing him lying there in civilian clothes. His name was Deputy Roger Watts, 15-year veteran, coached youth baseball on weekends. The news kept calling him a hero, but all I could think about was how he'd just been trying to help someone. By dawn, they'd tracked the stolen truck to a gas station camera 200 miles away. The shooter had ditched it and carjacked someone else, an elderly man who thankfully was left unharmed at a rest stop. The FBI got involved since it crossed state lines, and suddenly my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, investigators, even true crime podcasters somehow got my number. I couldn't go to work that night. Hell, I couldn't even sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smooth motion of the gun being drawn, heard that crack echo across the empty highway. The detective assigned to my witness testimony, a woman named Detective Howell, called me every few hours with updates. She said they'd identified the shooter through fingerprints on the abandoned car. Some guy named Travis Buckley, wanted for armed robbery in 4 states, had shot a store clerk in Georgia just 3 days earlier. He'd been using stolen cars and fake IDs to stay ahead of law enforcement for weeks. The roadside breakdown was probably another attempted carjacking, and Deputy Watts just happened to be the unlucky one who stopped. Detective Howell said Buckley had a pattern of violence that was escalating, and they were worried about what he might do if cornered. She asked if I'd noticed anything else, any detail that might help, and I spent hours going over those few minutes in my head, trying to pull something useful from the horror of it all. The manhunt intensified through Friday. They found the second stolen car abandoned at a strip mall. Surveillance footage showing Buckley breaking into a delivery van during the early morning hours. He was heading north, they thought, possibly trying to reach family in Kentucky. Social media was going crazy with sightings. Every gas station customer in a baseball cap became a potential suspect. I watched the news obsessively, switching between channels whenever they went to commercial. My sister Grace drove down to stay with me because she was worried about how I was handling it. She made coffee and sandwiches I couldn't eat, fielded phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The worst part was knowing he was still out there, that Deputy Watts' kids were probably watching these same news reports, seeing their dad's face next to headlines about manhunts and murder. His wife gave a statement Friday afternoon, thanking the community for support, asking for privacy. Her voice was steady, but you could see her jaw clenching between words, holding it together for the cameras. Saturday morning, everything changed. I woke up to Grace shaking me. I'd finally passed out on the couch around 4 a.m. The news was showing aerial footage of a neighborhood in Lexington, Kentucky. Police cars everywhere. SWAT vehicles blocking a residential street. They'd cornered Buckley in a house where his ex-girlfriend lived. She'd called police after he showed up at her door demanding money and car keys. The standoff had been going on for 2 hours already. Every news channel had reporters on scene, that weird mix of excitement and dread in their voices as they speculated about how it would end. The ex-girlfriend and her roommate had managed to escape through a back window, but Buckley had barricaded himself inside with at least 2 weapons they knew about. I sat there watching, still in the same clothes I'd been wearing since Thursday night, unable to look away from the screen. Part of me wanted him caught, needed him caught, but another part was terrified of more violence, more families destroyed. The footage went shaky around noon. You could hear gunshots even through the news helicopter's audio feed. The reporters started talking faster, trying to figure out what was happening. Police were moving in, shields up, surrounding the house from multiple angles. Then more gunshots, quick bursts that sounded different from the first ones. The camera zoomed in just as officers emerged from the front door, and you could see them giving hand signals to the teams outside. It was over. The reporter on scene got confirmation within minutes. Suspect in custody, wounded but alive, no officers injured. They showed him being wheeled out on a stretcher, and even from the distance, even with his face partially covered by an oxygen mask, I recognized the build, the way he held his shoulders. That was definitely the man from the highway. My phone rang immediately. Detective Howell confirming what I already knew from watching. She said he'd tried to shoot his way out but got hit in the shoulder and leg. He'd survived to stand trial, she assured me, and my testimony would be crucial. The relief I felt was overwhelming. but it was mixed with something else. This hollow feeling knowing that Deputy Watts wouldn't get to see justice served, wouldn't get to go home to his kids. The trial won't start for months, maybe a year, Detective Howell told me. But that night on the interstate plays in my head every single day. I went back to work eventually, but I quit the night shift. Couldn't handle those empty dark hours anymore. I drive a different route now when I visit Grace, even though it adds an hour to the trip. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd kept driving, if I hadn't stopped to watch. Would someone else have witnessed it? Would they have caught Buckley sooner? The sheriff's department set up a memorial fund for Deputy Watts's family, and I contributed what I could, but it feels like nothing compared to what was lost. His kids will grow up without their dad because he did what he always did, tried to help someone in need. That's the part that haunts me most, knowing that his kindness, his instinct to serve even off-duty, was what put him in danger. They found more evidence in that abandoned sedan. Receipts, DNA, enough to link Buckley to 6 other robberies across the Southeast. He'd been on this spree for almost 2 months, getting more desperate and violent with each crime. The prosecutor called me last week to prepare me for testimony. Said my witness account was the strongest evidence they had for the murder charge since there were no cameras on that stretch of highway. She warned me that I'd have to face him in court, look at him while I testified. The thought makes me sick, but I'll do it. For Deputy Watts, for his family, for some kind of closure to this nightmare. People keep telling me I was brave for staying, for calling 911, for being a witness. But I don't feel brave. I just feel like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in someone else's evil. The only hero in this story was buried last Sunday with full honors, his children holding folded flags, while the man who killed him sits in a cell waiting for a trial that will never bring their father back. The call came through dispatch around 3 p.m. on a Monday afternoon in late November. I'd been a patrol officer in our small Wisconsin town for about 6 years at that point, mostly dealing with drunk drivers and domestic disputes. Nothing too crazy. My partner that day was Officer Brennan, a rookie who'd only been on the force for 8 months. We were finishing up paperwork from a fender bender when the dispatcher's voice crackled through our radio. Unit 47, we need you to perform a welfare check at 1847 Old Mill Road. Family member reports Jennifer Hawthorne hasn't been answering calls for 4 days. Brennan looked at me and shrugged. Welfare checks were routine stuff. Usually just elderly folks who forgot to charge their phones or people who decided to take an impromptu vacation without telling anyone. I pulled up the address on our computer. The property was way out on the edge of our jurisdiction, one of those old farmhouses that sat isolated between cornfields and forest. The drive out there took about 25 minutes. The further we got from town, the fewer houses we saw. By the time we turned onto Old Mill Road, we hadn't passed another car for miles. The Hawthorne place sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides. It was one of those 2-story houses from the 1940s, white paint peeling off the siding, wrap-around porch sagging in places. What struck me first was how quiet everything was. No dogs barking, no birds chirping, just this heavy silence that seemed to press against my ears. All the curtains were drawn tight even though it was the middle of the afternoon. Brennan knocked on the front door while I walked around to check the windows. Mrs. Hawthorne? This is the police. We're just checking to make sure you're okay. No response. I tried peering through a gap in the living room curtains but couldn't see anything inside. The whole place had this abandoned feel to it, like nobody had been there in weeks. We tried the back door next. That's when I noticed something weird. Every single light switch I could see through the kitchen window was flipped to the on position, but the house was completely dark inside. Not dim, but pitch black, like the bulbs had all been painted over or something. Brennan was getting antsy, tapping his flashlight against his thigh. Maybe she's just not home, he suggested, but we both knew protocol. The concerned sister who'd called said Jennifer never left town without telling her. And her car was still parked in the driveway, a beat-up blue Ford Focus with a dream catcher hanging from the rearview mirror. I tested the back door handle. Unlocked. In rural areas, that wasn't unusual, but given the circumstances, it made the hair on my arms stand up. We announced ourselves again before entering. "Mrs. Hawthorne, this is Officers Coleman and Brennan. We're coming inside to check on you." The kitchen smelled wrong. Not like rot or death, I'd smelled those before, but like burnt plastic mixed with something metallic. Even with our flashlights, the darkness seemed to swallow the beams after a few feet. That's when we saw her. Jennifer Hawthorne was sitting on the linoleum floor with her back against the dishwasher, completely still. At first, I thought she was dead. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, and she didn't react when our flashlight beams hit her face. But then I saw her chest moving. Shallow, rapid breaths like a scared rabbit. There was blood on her forearms, not a lot, but enough to notice. Beside her right hand was a kitchen knife, the kind you'd use to chop vegetables. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" I kept my voice calm while Brennan called for backup and an ambulance. She didn't respond, didn't even blink, but when I took a step closer, her lips started moving. No sound came out, just this frantic mouthing of words I couldn't understand. That's when Brennan found the notes. "Coleman, you need to see this," he said, shining his light on the kitchen counter. There were pieces of paper everywhere. Napkins, receipts, torn notebook pages, even writing on the wooden cabinet doors in what looked like black marker. The handwriting was jagged and desperate, like someone writing in a panic. Most of it was the same phrase repeated over and over. "They're watching through the walls." Some variations included, "Don't trust the spaces between," and "They wait in the blind spots." One particularly disturbing note written on the back of a grocery list said, "If you can see all 4 corners of a room at once, you're safe. If you can't, they're already there." I photographed everything while Brennan stayed with Jennifer. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. Some notes had diagrams, crude drawings of rooms with X marks in certain spots, arrows pointing to walls, and circles drawn around light fixtures. The paramedics arrived about 15 minutes later, but Jennifer wouldn't let them touch her. The moment they approached, she started screaming, this raw, primal sound that made everyone in the room step back. It wasn't a normal scream. It was like she was seeing something we couldn't, something absolutely terrifying. She pressed herself harder against the dishwasher, her fingernails scraping against the floor. "The walls," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "Don't stand near the walls." They reach through. They've been reaching through for days. The lead paramedic, a guy named Novak who I'd worked with before, managed to calm her down enough to check her vitals. Her pulse was through the roof, pupils dilated, clear signs of severe psychological trauma. The cuts on her arms were superficial, probably self-inflicted based on the pattern. While they worked on her, I explored the rest of the house with Brennan. Every room told the same story. Furniture had been pushed away from the walls, creating these weird empty spaces around the perimeter. In the living room, the couch and chairs were clustered in the center like a makeshift island. The TV was unplugged and turned to face the wall. More notes were taped to door frames and windows. One that stuck with me was written on a piece of duct tape stretched across a heating vent. "They listen here most." In the bathroom, Jennifer had covered the mirror with newspaper, and the bathtub was filled with crumpled aluminum foil. Brennan pulled some out to examine it, and we realized each piece had tiny holes poked through it. Hundreds of them, like she'd been obsessively perforating the foil with a needle. The bedroom was the worst. She'd apparently been sleeping in the closet. We found a pile of blankets and pillows crammed in there, along with empty water bottles and granola bar wrappers. The actual bed had been dismantled, the mattress propped up to block the window. What really got to me were the photographs. In what used to be a home office, we found dozens of Polaroid pictures scattered across the desk. At first glance, they looked like normal photos of the house's exterior. Shots of the siding, the windows, the porch. But when you looked closer, there were these subtle differences. In one photo of the east wall, there was a shadow that didn't match anything that should have been casting it. In another, taken of the same spot maybe an hour later based on the sun position, The shadow had moved in a way that defied the light source. Jennifer had drawn red circles around these anomalies, with timestamps written in shaky handwriting. Some photos showed what looked like indentations in the grass near the house, forming rough semicircles. She'd written their breathing spots next to those. Brennan picked up one photo that showed the kitchen window from outside. In the reflection, you could see Jennifer taking the picture, but behind her there was something else, a dark shape that shouldn't have been there. We were still examining the photos when Novak called up from downstairs. They were ready to transport Jennifer, but she was becoming agitated again. When we got back to the kitchen, she was clutching a piece of paper to her chest, refusing to let go. "Please," she said, looking directly at me for the first time. Her eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles that looked like bruises. "Check the walls. Use a stud finder, promise me." I told her we would, just to calm her down. As they wheeled her out on the gurney, she kept repeating a sequence of numbers. 14 inches, 16 inches, 24 inches, that's where they hide. Standard stud spacing in walls, I realized. Brennan looked as unsettled as I felt. After the ambulance left, we should have just locked up and filed our report. But something about her desperation, the specificity of her fear, made me go back inside. I had a basic stud finder in my patrol car's toolkit. We sometimes used them to check walls before forcing entry. Starting in the kitchen where we'd found her, I ran the stud finder along the walls. Normal readings at first, beep every 16 inches where the wooden studs were. But then, near the corner by the pantry, the device went crazy. Instead of a single beep for a stud, it gave off this continuous signal, like the entire wall section was solid wood. That wasn't right. I tried another wall, same thing in certain spots. These patches where the stud finder indicated solid mass behind the drywall, always in corners or near the floor. Brennan was checking the living room and called out, "Coleman, I'm getting weird readings too." We compared notes. Every room had these anomalies, always in spots where furniture had been pushed away. In the office, I found Jennifer's notebook with more detailed observations. She'd been tracking these dense spots for weeks, marking them on a hand-drawn floor plan of the house. According to her notes, they appeared gradually, starting in the basement and working their way up. The last entry, dated 3 days ago, simply said, "They're in all the walls now. Can hear them breathing when the house is quiet." Against all protocol and common sense, I put my ear against one of the anomalous spots in the wall. Brennan thought I'd lost it, but I had to know. The drywall felt warm, warmer than it should have been for a November afternoon. And then I heard it. This faint rhythmic sound, like air moving through a narrow space. Not mechanical like pipes or ventilation, but organic, irregular, like breathing. I jerked back so fast I knocked over a lamp. Brennan heard it too when he tried, his face going pale. "We need to get out of here and call this in," he said, already backing toward the door. But I couldn't leave without checking one more thing. Jennifer's notes mentioned the basement. If this started there, maybe we'd find answers. The basement door had 7 deadbolts installed on it, all locked from the kitchen side. Who put 7 deadbolts on their basement door? We unlocked them one by one, and the door swung open to reveal wooden stairs descending into darkness. The smell that wafted up was indescribable. Earth and moisture and something else, something alive. Our flashlights revealed a typical unfinished basement at first. Concrete floor, exposed beams, water heater in the corner. But the walls were wrong. Instead of concrete or cinder blocks, sections had been carved away, revealing what looked like tunnels extending beyond the foundation. Fresh tool marks showed someone had been digging recently, but the tunnels themselves looked old, older than the house, ancient even. The openings were roughly circular, about 3 feet in diameter, and they branched off in multiple directions. Brennan grabbed my arm. "Those aren't man-made," he whispered. He was right. The edges were too smooth, too organic. Like something had burrowed through the earth, leaving these perfectly round passages. We heard it then, movement from deep within one of the tunnels. Not footsteps, but a sliding, shuffling sound. Multiple sources, getting closer. That's when we ran. We burst out of that house and didn't stop until we were in the patrol car. I called it in as a potential environmental hazard, recommending immediate evacuation of the area. The house was condemned within 48 hours, and Jennifer was transferred to a psychiatric facility in Madison for evaluation. But here's what haunts me. The county records showed those tunnels extended under 6 other properties in a 3-mile radius. All of them occupied, all of them with residents who'd never reported anything unusual, at least not yet. I used to work as a patrol officer in a relatively quiet suburban area, the kind of place where most calls were about noise complaints or the occasional traffic accident. Back then, I had been on the force for a little over 6 years, and I was starting to believe I'd already seen the worst the neighborhood could throw at me. That afternoon, I was finishing up paperwork in the squad car when dispatch radioed in about a welfare check. The caller, a neighbor, said an elderly man named Walter Price hadn't been seen all day, and he usually took his morning walk, rain or shine. Something about the neighbor's tone, steady but with an edge, made me pay attention. When I pulled up to Walter's house, the first thing I noticed was how still everything felt. His front yard was neat, with trimmed hedges and a row of ceramic bird statues along the walkway, but the curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the daylight. The front door wasn't just unlocked, it was slightly ajar, and there was no sign of forced entry. I knocked, called out his name, and stepped inside. The air was stale, almost heavy, carrying a faint scent I couldn't place right away. The living room looked normal at first glance, but as I moved closer, I saw that the coffee table had been knocked sideways, and there were small flecks of something dark on the carpet. Walter's armchair, the one neighbors said he always sat in to read the paper, was angled oddly toward the hallway, as if it had been shoved during a struggle. One of the lamp cords had been pulled taut, stretching toward the floor, and a framed family photo was lying face down beside it. I didn't see any sign of Walter, and I didn't hear any movement from the rest of the house. That strange stillness stayed with me as I called in for backup. While waiting, I checked the kitchen. Everything looked in order, coffee mug still on the counter untouched. His wallet sat on the dining table, and his keys were right beside it, like he'd planned to go out and never got the chance. When my partner, Officer Lena Morris, arrived, we decided to check the rest of the house together. Upstairs was empty, no signs of anything unusual beyond the closed-off air of a place that hadn't been lived in for at least a day. Then we moved toward the basement door at the back of the kitchen. It was closed but not locked. The second Lena swung it open, a wave of cooler, damp air came up from below. We descended slowly, our flashlights cutting through the dimness. At first, I thought the dark shape in the corner was just an old tarp thrown over some furniture. But the closer we got, the more its outline became unmistakable. The tarp was pulled tight over something bulky, and there was a faint metallic smell in the air that made the space feel colder than it already was. Lena glanced at me without saying a word, and I knelt down to lift one corner. What I saw underneath took a moment to process. Walter's body motionless with a deep wound across his temple. His clothing was neat, like he hadn't been in the middle of anything when it happened, but his right hand was curled into a fist, nails digging into his palm. There was no sign of a robbery. His watch was still on his wrist, and his wedding ring was in place. We backed up and called it in immediately, sealing off the house until detectives arrived. While we waited, I kept thinking about the odd details. No forced entry, no missing valuables, and that unsettling stillness when I'd first walked in. Neighbors started gathering on the sidewalk, whispering in small clusters. One woman, a few houses down, told me she'd seen a delivery van parked outside earlier that morning. It wasn't a company she recognized, and she hadn't thought much of it until she noticed it was gone barely 20 minutes later. The strange part was, Walter never ordered anything online, and no deliveries had been scheduled. Detectives combed the house while crime scene techs took photos and bagged evidence. In the living room, they found a single scuff mark on the hardwood floor near the entryway. as if something heavy had been dragged across it. The basement stairs had a faint smear on the railing. Nothing obvious, but enough to swab. I couldn't shake the image of that tarp in the dim basement corner, and how methodically it had been tucked around him. Whoever did it hadn't rushed. It was deliberate, like they had time to arrange everything before leaving. Later that night, we canvassed the block again, knocking on doors in case anyone else had seen the van. One man said he thought it might have been a white Ford with no company logo, just a strip of green tape along the side. He assumed it was a rental, maybe for moving furniture. Nobody had seen the driver's face clearly, only that they wore a baseball cap pulled low. The description wasn't much, but it was all we had. 2 days later, surveillance footage from a gas station less than a mile away gave us our first real lead. The white van was there, pulling in for fuel less than an hour before Walter's neighbor claimed to have seen it at his house. The driver never looked toward the camera, keeping the cap low, but the build suggested someone younger, maybe mid-30s. Detectives traced the rental back to a fake ID, and that's where the trail went cold, at least for a while. The working theory was that Walter had opened the door for someone pretending to deliver a package, someone who knew how to appear harmless just long enough to be let inside. A week later, a similar van turned up in another part of the county, abandoned behind a strip mall. Inside, there was a single box sealed with packing tape and no label. Forensics found faint traces of the same fibers from Walter's carpet inside the van, confirming it was connected. The box itself was empty, but its weight suggested it had recently held something heavy. The driver had vanished without a trace, leaving us with more questions than answers. It wasn't random. Too many details lined up for it to be chance. Walter's family couldn't think of anyone who'd want to hurt him. He lived quietly, had no known enemies, and spent most of his time tending to his garden or chatting with neighbors. That's what made it harder. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it felt planned. The idea that someone could walk right into a home in broad daylight, kill a man, hide his body in the basement, and leave without taking anything was something the neighborhood struggled to wrap its head around. Even for me, it changed the way I looked at every routine call after that. To this day, the case remains unsolved. Every time I drive through that street, I can't help but glance at Walter's old house, now sold to a new family who probably has no idea what happened there. The ceramic bird statues are still lined up along the walkway, faded and weathered now, like quiet witnesses to something they can never tell. I still think about how quickly an ordinary day can twist into something you'll carry with you forever, and how sometimes the scariest part isn't what you find, it's knowing the person responsible might still be out there.